Good afternoon from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania at the National Historical Park here on a chilly December afternoon. We're only a couple of days off of the anniversary. The Continental Army moved into Valley Forge on December the 19th, so it's only a couple of days ago, December the 21st today, so winter solstice, happy winter solstice for those of you that celebrate the solstice, and I guess the days are going to start drawing out now. But we're here at Valley Forge and we're going to be talking today about the winter at Valley Forge of 1777-1778, which is a critical part of the history of the Continental Army. It really sees one of the low points of the Continental Army, and it also sees the rebirth of the Continental Army as a much more professional formation. So I'm actually here in one of the reconstructed redoubts on the defensive line at Valley Forge. As you can see, it's a good reconstruction here. The revetments, of course, are solid wood here. It probably would have been fascines and gabions at the time, baskets filled with so on and so forth. There's very simple earthwork redoubts that they used here. So you excavate a ditch, the dirt from the ditch is used to form an earth embankment. The earth embankment is reinforced by abatis so that just as a sharp sticks as a preventative measure for getting in. There's a slight glycis on the front of the earthwork to bounce some balls off. So this is a very simple redoubt. As you can see, it's not exactly mounted with heavy cannon. These are small light field pieces. So the Continental Army brought its field artillery into the winter camp as well, and those were placed in these redoubts as protective formations. So very small. If we pan around, and that mound in the middle there is the powder magazine for the redoubt, where they would have stored powder. The redoubt doesn't need to be very complicated. It's just a very simple earthwork. It just needs to be high enough that I can duck down below the parapet and not get struck by a musket ball or hit by a piece of case shot. And it just needs to have the firing points in it that are sufficient to allow the internal cannon to fire. This would have been one of many redoubts on the defensive line. I'm roughly in the position here of Muhlenberg's brigade, so in Green's division. So we're going to walk through the redoubt here and across to some of the reconstructed soldiers' huts. So Muhlenberg's brigade was all Virginia regiments in Nathaniel Green's division here at Valley Forge. So why did the Continental Army come to Valley Forge in that winter, in that December of 1777? The Continental Army and its commander, George Washington, coming off a series of defeats, really. The army has been defeated at Brandywine. The army has been defeated at Germantown. The army has been forced out of Philadelphia, and it has to go into winter cantonment. We're about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia here at Valley Forge. This was the site selected because it's on some high ground. It has the Schuylkill River as a water source, and there's good farmland around here as well. So with the provisioning of the Continental Army was very much they're living off the farmland, they're living off the local land. One of the problems with the commissary and the quartermaster supplies of the Continental Army in this period was that it was very inefficient. So the troops that marched in here to Valley Forge, some of them came in here with empty bellies. So we know the stories of how men didn't have coats for the winter, how many of the men didn't even have shoes, their shoes had worn out. But just getting food supplies through to the Continental Army at this period. There's about 12,000 men with camp followers, so quite a significant amount of people that you've got to feed and house and so forth. The first shelters that were dug here, the first shelters that were constructed here at Valley Forge Of course, tent lines went up, and then there were these brush shelters. You cut brush, very much a wilderness survival Cub Scout kind of thing today. You make a frame and you pile brush up against it. You've got a brush shelter, so that can keep out some of the elements. So these are some of the first shelters that were built here at Valley Forge in that winter. Now, the mythology of Valley Forge is that it was a horrendous winter, and there was, like, you know, snow up to everybody's waistline, and it was the most miserable winter of record. It was not the most miserable winter of record. It was just an average Pennsylvania mid-Atlantic winter. So similar temperatures that we have today. Of course, there would have been snow across the winter. The Army was here from December all the way through to May and June of 1778. So the Army was here for a good 5 to 6 months. So the winter is just a part of that. Now, there was snow, and there was hunger, and there was cold. I've just driven up from Maryland today. When I got up this morning and went out to feed the horses, it was a balmy 27 degrees Fahrenheit, so below freezing. I had to crack the ice on the water trough for the horses. That's quite a cold morning. So if you're sleeping in a tent, a canvas tent, if you're sleeping under a brush shelter, maybe have a threadbare blanket that you share with somebody. When they're on guard duty, you get the blanket, and when it's your turn on guard duty, they get the blanket. But in a brush shelter or a canvas tent in this kind of temperature, it's very, very cold and very, very inhospitable. So it became evident very, very quickly that the tented lines, the tented company lines and regiment lines would not be sufficient winter accommodation for the Continental Army. And so the men began cutting down every tree in sight, cutting them for logs, and they would construct winter accommodation. They would construct crude huts. We're walking down to those now, and part of Muhlenberg's line, as I said, those Virginia regiments. We'll have a look at some of the reconstructed huts that the Park Service have put together. I'm just going to take a short break. There's some folks down there. I think there's some kids down there doing their Junior Ranger packet at the moment, so I don't want to interrupt them. I'll let them pass through, and then I'll go down to the huts. So the winter at Valley Forge, there's a lot of mythology surrounding the winter at Valley Forge about it being a horrendous winter. It was a bad winter, but it was no worse than any other winter. There's the subsequent portraiture of George Washington praying in the snow and all that sort of thing. And we're not really sure that happened. That's really kind of like mythologizing the whole thing. The conditions here were bad. So as I said, there was about 12,000 soldiers came into the encampment. A good 3,000 of those were without shoes, without coats. So that's a good quarter of the army was so poorly equipped that I've got, a multi-layered in Carhartt today, and I'm still a bit chilly. To think of being out here in just a linen shirt and a pair of breeches and no shoes even on an afternoon like this where it's about 40 degrees Fahrenheit does not appeal to me at all. So it was uncomfortable, and as soon as the snow started and when the rain came through and so forth, it was very uncomfortable for those men. So when the army got into its winter encampment, one of the most important things that Washington needed to do was to sort out his quartermaster situation, and not just the food supply from the commissary, but the quartermaster, the clothing situation. It was very, very difficult for him. Meigs had just resigned as Commissary General of the Army, and nobody wanted to be, Quartermaster General of the Army. Nobody wanted to be the quartermaster. It was a thankless job. In the end, Washington managed to persuade Nathanael Greene to act as Quartermaster General of the Continental Army, rather than have Congress appoint a factotum to run the Continental Army's Quartermaster Corps. So it fell upon Greene then to find uniforms and shoes and field equipment for the Continental Army. So let's walk down to the huts now. I think the Junior Ranger guys have moved on. So if you have kids and you come visit a national park, so Gettysburg, Valley Forge, Arches National Park. Stop at the visitor centre, ask for the Junior Ranger packet. They give you like a little workbook and a pencil, and when you go around the park with your kids can fill in the workbook as they go around. Once they've filled it in, you take it back to the visitor centre at the end of your tour. They ask you a couple of questions, the ranger asks you a couple of questions, then you raise your right hand and they swear you in as a junior ranger for that particular park and give you a nice little reproduction gold badge with the park's name on it. So if you have children, that's a really neat thing for them to get into if you're visiting the national parks. And so as a party of kids I just saw come through here filling in their worksheets, very excited because they're going to get their little gold Valley Forge badge. So the brush shelters were very simple, the tents were very simple, and then we come to, that's the sound of a heavy truck down there on 76. We're very close to the highway. One of the things that strikes you when you're at Valley Forge is how close you are to major shopping centres and major highways. It was farmland at the time, but it's no longer farmland. This is very much suburban, and the city is sprawling out to reach us. As you can see, reconstructed huts here, very simple log huts, very simple wood shingle roofs. As you can see, the rear of every hut is a short chimney stack so that fires could be built within the huts and to keep those soldiers warm. So it's a very, very simple construction, very, very basic. And these are reconstructions by the Park Service. But this was good enough to keep the troops warm throughout the winter and provided adequate accommodation for them. If you come out here to Valley Forge and you drive the tour out, you'll find reconstructed huts at different points along the loop. Usually signifying where a particular brigade was encamped. Valley Forge was horrendous in many ways. Hunger was a perpetual problem. And let's see if we can get inside one of the huts down here. I think one of them is open and we should be able to just maybe step inside and just do a quick hut tour here before I talk a little bit more. So as you can see, very low ceiling, and we're going to come in here. Oh. So very crude bunks, and so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 bunks. Ooh. 12 bunks. You can get 12 men in there. You can get a full squad of infantrymen in there, full squad of soldiers in there. So the huts solved the accommodation problem that required a lot of manpower and actual physical effort to fell those trees, cut these logs, build these huts. It kept the men busy, it kept them occupied. As they say, you know, the devil makes work for idle hands. If you have a lot of hungry, badly clothed soldiers sitting around just grousing and grumbling and complaining with nothing to do, trouble will ensue. So if you keep people busy, such as building huts, particularly if you say the sooner you get this hut built, the warmer you're going to be, that keeps them busy. That resolved the accommodation issue. So you've got a wooden hut, you've got a fireplace in the hut, you can get out of the weather, you can keep warm, you've got a bunk that you can sleep on. That resolved the accommodation problem. The food problem was much more pronounced. So the army had to essentially live off the land. There was no just huge supply organisation supplying the army with pre-prepared meals. No MRE chili mac in those days, guys. So they had to find provisions locally from local farms to provision the Continental Army here. That required going to farms and trying to persuade those farmers to sell you grain to sell you corn, to sell you preserved apples, all sorts of things, to serve you hams, to sell you that stuff for what was effectively worthless paper currency issued by the Congress. So the Congress just essentially painted paper specie, paper script, banknotes, as you will, and they just printed and printed and printed, and of course you get hyperinflation and the money is worthless. So trying to persuade a local farmer to accept a giant wad of cash that's worthless, it's, in fact, the paper that it's printed on is probably worth more than the value of the note. To try and get a farmer to accept that would prove to be very, very difficult. One of the ways that farmers tried to get around having these goods taken and paid for in worthless script was that they would try and load their wagons up and sneak their way into British lines down at Derby or in Philadelphia. There's a large contingent of the army. British Army was encamped down at Derby, Pennsylvania, so they weren't all in Philadelphia. There was a split between the army. So they'd try and get into British lines, get into Philadelphia, and sell their farm goods for hard currency, good British gold, good British silver. So one of the ways that the Continental Army was able to provision itself was by sending out foraging patrols that would essentially intercept these farmers. These farmers were arrested. They'd be tried by a court-martial, a military court-martial, which would say, oh, you're supplying the enemy with victuals, and we're going to confiscate that as a fine upon you. And that's one of the ways that the Continental Army was able to actually provision itself. One of the members of the Continental Army that was became and earned quite a good reputation for operating between the lines, between the American defensive lines here and the British lines down at Derby and towards Pennsylvania, was Captain Harry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee, commanding a small unit of dragoons. And he was able to, with a mounted unit, scour this area, looking for these farmers that were trying to smuggle food into Philadelphia and intercept them. So you may recognise the name Lee. That will come up in a much later war, and perhaps when we're back out at Gettysburg next time, we'll talk about the connection between Light Horse Harry Lee and General Robert E. Lee. So the provisioning of the army was of course a problem. Washington would send dispatches to the Congress asking for supplies, and nothing would come. He would send more dispatches asking for supplies, and nothing would come. Congress sent a delegation of congressmen here to meet Washington to examine the situation during that winter at Valley Forge, find out the state of the Continental Army. Was it really as bad as Washington was saying? And they sent a congressional delegation, and Washington presented them with a report that was compiled by his military aide, Alexander Hamilton. They compiled a report listing all the deficiencies in the Continental Army regarding clothing, weapons, gunpowder, food, etc., and was actually able to persuade Congress, yes, something must be done, and to improve the situation here at Valley Forge. Now, men died here at Valley Forge. As I say, when the army came in, the army was about 12,000 strong when it came in here to Valley Forge. Now, some of those men, their enlistments would expire and they would return home. Some officers would resign their commissions out of frustration and return home. So the army did begin to shrink here. There were, of course, desertions. If you're up here and you're hungry and you don't have a jacket, you probably figure out, well, if I can get down to the British lines and surrender, I'll be taken prisoner. At least they'll maybe put me inside a building and I won't be cold, and they may even feed me. So men deserted from here as well. Men also died here. So some men died of malnutrition, some men died of exposure because of the cold. So the cold would lead to things like pleurisy and pneumonia and carry men off. And then the camp diseases, the common camp diseases of the time, due to poor sanitation, such as typhoid fever, typhus, dysentery, carried off large numbers of men in the Continental Army. So between 2,000 and 2,500 men died here at Valley Forge, not through enemy action, but through sickness and disease. So if you lose 1/6 of your combat strength through disease, I mean, you can tell that there's something fundamentally wrong with the organisation of the army. Now, the army had built these huts and laid them out in company streets, in regimental areas and then in brigade areas, and had organised the defensive lines here. They'd managed to do that, but other things were amiss with the army. The Continental Army was still essentially regiments that had been raised by states and sent up here. They were all equipped differently, they were all trained differently, they all behaved differently, so some felt that they owed more allegiance to their state than to the United States. So there's a disorganisation within the army. These are volunteers, these are not professional soldiers. These are not professional soldiers raised in a way that they knew how to lay camps out. They knew about field sanitation. So if we're going to dig a latrine here, where are we going to dig a latrine? Well, I mean, if you're a farm boy and if you're a farm boy and you're out in the field and you've been ploughing, or a farm boy and you're out in the field and you've been, hunting squirrels, and you're walking through a wood line and you need to pee, you're probably going to look around. No one's there. I'm going to pee up against this tree. I mean, you're a farm boy. That's what you do. Well, you can't have 100 men living in huts here who every time they want to use the bathroom just step outside and pee against the wall of the hut. That's unsanitary. So you have to dig latrines, and you have to think about where you're going to dig those latrines. You don't want to dig them right next to where you live. You don't want to dig them near your drinking water source. And so there were sanitation problems here, and that's of course what led to the dysentery and the typhoid and all those waterborne diseases that carry people away here during that winter. So we have this disorganised army that's not uniformly trained. We have an army that doesn't understand basic field sanitation. We have an army of soldiers that, the independent American spirit. There's a line that von Steuben used when he described the American army, the difference between the American army and the Continental Army, having served in the Prussian army. He said that if he said to a Prussian soldier, do this, like attack that hill with the enemy on it, attack that hill, they do it. If you said to an American soldier, do this, attack that hill, do that, they'd ask why. Like, why are we attacking that hill? And you'd have to explain to them, we're attacking that hill because, and this is how we're going to do it. So there was this independent American spirit which still persists today, where some of these regiments had elected officers, had elected their sergeants. So the officers and the sergeants sometimes held authority because of their popularity with the men, because they were respected by the men as individuals, but also because maybe this was the nice, let's elect the nice guy captain, he won't yell at us so much. So there's all sorts of problems with the Continental Army, its organisation and its training. And coming back to von Steuben, Baron von Steuben, General von Steuben, whatever we want to call him, this is perhaps the most important thing to come out of the winter at Valley Forge. So we have the coldness of the winter, we have the army in rags, we have the provisions that have to be found. So there's all these quartermaster problems that have to be resolved to keep the army fed and clothed, and an actual army. But the army needs to be retrained. The army needs to become a professional army, not just former militiamen who've now been called Continental regiments. It needs to be turned into a professional, organised army where all the men are trained uniformly and know what they're doing. And as luck would have it, a man arrives who can do that, and that is von Steuben, a former captain in the Prussian army, who, after his dismissal from the Prussian army, seeks to become a soldier of fortune. The original family name was Stoib. The family then changed its name to Steuben to make it sound more gentrified. Steuben's father added the von to make them sound even more gentrified, so von Steuben. And in his subsequent to his Prussian service, Captain von Steuben somehow managed to become Baron von Steuben. Having met the American plenipotentiary in Paris, a chap called Benjamin Franklin, and asking for a letter of introduction to go to the Americas and fight in the Americas with the American Army, become an American citizen. Somewhere in the translation there, Captain von Steuben was somehow turned into Lieutenant General von Steuben of the Prussian Army. So this is how we know him as General von Steuben. It doesn't really matter whether he was a general or not, because what you had was a Prussian captain. Now, Prussian military in that period, that 7 Years' War period, von Steuben had fought in the 7 Years' War, been wounded in the 7 Years' War. This was the Prussian army. This was not a bunch of disorganized farmers and merchants. This was the Prussian army, a well-drilled, highly disciplined army. And von Steuben was a captain, and maybe actually what you want is a captain. You want those company grade officers, and really what you want is you need your good NCOs, you need your top sausage, you need your top sergeant running that company, and you need good NCOs. But what they got was a good Prussian captain, a good drill master. He came here with a letter of introduction that introduced him as Lieutenant General Baron von Steuben, a volunteer. Washington obviously could not appoint this man that just had arrived with a couple of assistants and a pet Italian greyhound and didn't speak a word of English. He was not going to appoint him as a lieutenant general in the American Army, nor a major general, nor a brigadier general. That was not going to happen. What he did was appointed him, because he was a professional soldier, he appointed him as Inspector General. So the role of Inspector General is very much in this period. The role of Inspector General is you are the man in charge of training. You are the man in charge of the organisation and the training and the discipline of the army. And this was a job that von Steuben excelled at. So he didn't speak English, so we had to have a translator that spoke German, and we had to then translate the German commands that von Steuben was shouting and explaining into English for the soldiers. Von Steuben formed a demonstration company of 100 men. And it started with those 100 men. So he started with like a company-sized unit. As a captain, he was used to drilling 100 men. And he drilled those 100 men. He took men from every regiment and formed this demonstration company. He was then able to drill those men so that they knew how to stand, they knew how to load in time, so they could get to firing 3 shots a minute from their muskets. They know how to march, they know how to counter-march, they knew how to manoeuvre in the field, they knew the words of command, they knew what to do on the words of command. He turned this demonstration company into a well-disciplined drill unit. This well-disciplined drill unit then was able to be broken up. The 100 men were able to go back to their brigades, and in their brigades form a drill company within their brigades. They would then become the instructors, the drill instructors, the marksmanship instructors, and the drill masters, those drill sergeants, effectively. As I said, you need good NCOs. So they came back, and you'd form these drill sergeants that are able to form brigade demonstration companies and train a group of men within the brigade. When that group of men within the brigade had been trained, they would again break up, go to the individual regiments and train within the individual regiments. So by a process of trickling down from von Steuben's 100 men down to the brigade level and then down to the regimental level, you were able to trickle down and flow through the professionalisation of the army here at Valley Forge. So when we talk about Valley Forge, when we talk about the winter of 1777, 1778, and we get that mythology of like, it was cold, and they had to share a blanket, they had no shoes, they were starving. All true, all true. But the takeaway from Valley Forge is not the misery of Valley Forge. The takeaway from Valley Forge that we should take away from Valley Forge is the professionalisation of the American Army. Now, the American Army celebrates its birthday, traces its birthday back to 1775. And true, the American Army, the Continental Army, was founded in 1775. So, that will be that's the birth date of the American Army. Excuse me. But really, 2.5 years later, this winter here of 1777, and getting into the spring of 1778, when the snow has started to recede and the cold weather's getting better, the army is now getting more clothing coming through, some of it captured from British sources and supplying the American army, but also from the individual states and from Congress. Supplies are being more regularized. The army is growing in strength here from its original 12,000. As I said, it's suffered casualties across the winter. It's suffered desertions across the winter. But other states are now sending in units to join the Continental Army here. So you're going to get, it's not just going to be the Pennsylvanians and the Virginians here and the Rhode Island people. We're going to get regiments now coming up from Maryland to reinforce the Continental Army, and the Continental Army is going to grow to a strength of about 20,000 trained men, professional soldiers. Maybe not as battle-hardened as some of the British troops, but they will become as battle-hardened as some of the British troops. They have been turned from a disorganized army into a professional army. Valley Forge should be noted for the professionalization of the American army. So yes, it should be noted as Valley Forge. It was a hard winter. They had huts, but the takeaway should be the professionalization of the American army, and that then will become evident when the British abandon Philadelphia and the American army pursues the British away from Philadelphia, and we get those battles such as Monmouth. You can see the professionalization of the American army in effect. So that work that von Steuben had done, and the work that those drill sergeants had done in transforming American soldiers in this period from, you'd say, we've got to go and attack that. That's a British line there, and we've got to go and attack it. We're going to advance, and we're going to be fired upon, and we're going to pause, we're going to return fire, and then we're going to go in the bayonet. And it's going to be miserable, and it's going to be horrible, and it's going to be bloody, but we're going to do it because that's what's necessary to be done to win this battle. And the American soldiers will be like, yes, we are professional soldiers, we're going to do that. And so the professionalization of the American army is the big takeaway from Valley Forge. For me, I believe that's the most important thing from Valley Forge. So the mythology of George Washington praying in the snow makes a good Christmas card. It's nice to come and hike out here at Valley Forge. There's a big long hiking trail which takes you around the loop. You can hike it, you can ride it on a bicycle. There are facilities for you to bring a horse trailer up here and ride. There are 1,500 acres of grassland here. This is the largest concentration of open grassland in the area. We're in a very suburban, urban area here, but there's 1,500 acres of grassland here, open grassland for trail riding, which is also phenomenal for wildlife. You see a lot of wildlife here when the grass is high, and you see the wildflowers and you see the birds in those wildflowers. You see white-tailed deer come through here. I've seen foxes come through here. There's even a pack of coyotes in the park as well. But you can trailer a horse up here and ride around the trail on horseback. Could be a very interesting way to tour the battlefield. Tour it by bicycle, tour it on foot, or just drive the auto tour. So there's a lot to do up here at Valley Forge. It's very accessible from the Mid-Atlantic region. It's very accessible. We're really just outside of modern Philadelphia. In 1777 we were 20 miles from Philadelphia, but we're no longer 20 miles from Philadelphia thanks to interstates, and you can get into Philadelphia very easy. So Philadelphia is a good place to base yourself if you want to come out to Valley Forge. And there's lots of other things in the area as well. You can get down to Brandywine, the battlefield, quite easily as there. Get across to Germantown on that battlefield. You can go across the river to Fort Mercer. You can go to Paoli. You can go to all sorts of places that are related to out here outside of Philadelphia. So other than the Liberty Bell and downtown Independence Hall in Philadelphia, you can get out here do some real good AMREV and Revolutionary War sites out here in what's effectively now the suburbs of Philadelphia. So that's Valley Forge. Just a brief introduction and a brief description of Valley Forge in that winter of 1777, 1778. I do like these reconstructed huts. They're very dimly lit inside, so not really conducive to filming inside. It's a really nice thing that the Park Service maintain here, particularly if you've got, and I have come up here with my son when he was little, particularly if you've got a bunch of kids with you and they want to run in and out of things. During the winter there's not much going on. During the summer there are more ranger programs here. Of course, tourism is heavier during the summer, so there's more ranger programs out here. So if you come out on some of these locations during the summer and tour during the summer, there'll be living history, historical interpreters here who will have some tent lines up, some campfires going, and will talk through some of the period history as well. So well worth visiting here. So that was Valley Forge, and I'm going to, while the daylight still holds for another hour or so, I'm going to be at some other sites around the park today, take a few photographs, post those up on the Facebook page. But I hope you enjoyed just a little talk from Valley Forge today. It's nice occasionally to break away from doing, there's so many Civil War sites around that are easy for us to get to and do live stream tours from. It was nice to get back to Revolutionary War, Rev War site, and do something different from Civil War for a change. So I'll also post some links online later on. I'll drop those in the comments to the video with some links for additional information on Valley Forge, particularly the winter here, and particularly von Steuben. There's a couple of few good podcasts out here, and I'll post some links to those, post some additional video, post some additional photographs as well, maybe some book recommendations. So I'll post a whole bunch of stuff up on the Facebook page after that. So thank you for joining me today. Hope you enjoyed it. There'll be lots of content up on the Facebook page, facebook.com/walkingtheground. I will save a copy of this video hopefully and upload it to YouTube, so it will just be backed up to YouTube as well. These talks are all free. I'm happy to come out and do them. It's usually on Tuesdays like today, where I've kind of got a day off and I'm out and about and think like, where can I go today? What can I do today? So that's why I enjoy doing them. Absolutely free of charge. If you want to support the content, if you want to support my gas mileage or my coffee habit, you can go to Ko-fi.com. I'll post a link to that as well at some point, and you can buy me a $3 cup of coffee, and I'll head right down the road to Dunkin' Donuts and buy a extra large coffee, warm myself up. And so thank you to everybody that's bought me a coffee so far. I literally do spend that money on coffee. You'll never get rich being a battlefield guide, that's for sure, but I certainly do appreciate all the support that everybody's given me over this last year. So this is my last tour of 2021. Wow, what a year it's been. We're moving into 2022. If you look on the Facebook page, there are more events listed on the Facebook page. We're going to be out at Hanover, Pennsylvania, talking about cavalry action of the 30th of June, 1863. So that's Jeb Stuart versus Kilpatrick and Custer. We're going to be in Baltimore, down at Fort McHenry, talking about the War of 1812, so Star Spangled Banner, assault on Fort McHenry, Battle of North Point, all that stuff. We've got some other stuff coming up. We're going to be back at Gettysburg again, talking about the canine mascots of some of the regiments. Some of the regiments took dogs to war with them as canine mascots, so we're going to be doing a little featurette on canine mascots at Gettysburg. So there's a whole bunch of stuff up on the website, up on the Facebook page, and check out those events. Just click going or interested, and I hope to see you on the live streams. So thanks for joining me today. Hope it was interesting to you. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. I can't really respond to comments as they're coming in live because I'm just on a single device. But as soon as I get back to my office, my office space, I'll fire up the computer, I'll go through the comments and answer whatever questions you post. If you've got any questions, please drop them in the comments to this video and I'll get to those as quickly as I can. Thanks for joining me today here at Valley Forge, and I hope you enjoyed the little talk. Thank you.